Hello, welcome to this video. Thank you so much for tuning in and sharing in this now moment with myself and with one another. If you haven't seen these videos before, welcome back if you have. My intention is unity and oneness in the highest levels of love light. I just wanted to kind of pop on here, do a quick energy update, a recap of some of the things that I've been seeing, messages I've been getting from my higher guidance team, and then maybe go into a little flow. I don't know, I might do part 1 and part 2. The first thing I wanted to just kind of share is a little recap of what many people have been experiencing and expressing to me in the work that I do, which if you're not familiar with us, I do intuitive work, energy work, and everything that kind of fits into those categories, so to speak, even though it's beyond all of that, it's basically quantum work, right? Which we all do on one level or another. There is always a ripple effect in our field. There's always this action at a distance, right? This spooky, as Einstein called it. So we are all working in multiple fields of reality from my perspective. Some of us are just doing it a little more consciously than others. And so when we work in the field, when we're doing energy work, or we're tuning into potentials in the field, or we're working with beings who are on the other side, which I also do, when we're working with our ancestors or people who, either way, we are working with multiple aspects of this frequency and energy that moves through all things. And so one of the things I've been really called to just remind everybody about is that we are much, much, much more capable and magical than we even know. Some people know it and are very open about it, but there's a lot of people they don't think they're doing enough. They don't think things are happening fast enough. They don't necessarily think that their work is important. And if I go back and listen to a lot of the messages that I've shared, that I've been in flow about, which is a rhyming, poetic way of speaking, which is how my guidance team kind of communicates with me, the biggest message is everything has changed. And essentially what they've been saying in my previous videos, and I'll just say it in an easier way because sometimes it's hard to understand in the way that I do when I'm in flow, is that everything has changed. Are we willing to recognize that? Many of us have been so locked into a certain habitual pattern that we're finding it difficult to see anything outside of that pattern. And that can be one of our biggest challenges. So taking a step back and just taking a deep breath in and really feeling into the energy and being present with it can sometimes take us out of our container that we've held ourselves in before, because that container has expanded so significantly that it's almost what my guides say, unfathomable. And when I'm tuning into the field, it is so cool. And it's hard to put into a linear conceptualization or words to describe what it is that I'm seeing and feeling into. I'm feeling into the vastness of what we really are, which is everything. And so bringing it back to our human form, our human experience, within this container and this skin suit, the message that comes through the most is we don't even know our own capabilities. So really getting out of our head about what we think we're capable of. And that includes the what ifs. And so I want to talk a little bit about what if, but let me kind of stay on that flow for just a moment. Our skin suit is a package deal. We are connected to energy. We are conductors and we are receivers of frequency. So when we conduct ourselves in a higher frequency and vibration, our environment matches that. We could call it the law of attraction, but there's this misconceptualization about the law of attraction, that if we only think happy thoughts, that creates our reality. I've seen time and time again, people who think they're high vibe and sunshine and rainbows, and I'm only going to focus on this. But inside, they're sad because there's a part of them that's being denied. And I'm just going to go there because I'm human as much as I am tuning into the quantum field. But essentially, from my perspective, we are having emotions, an emotional charge. We're experiencing things that are high and low. And because of that extreme range, that's part of what makes us special and unique and individual. Otherwise, we'd all be floating around in the ethers and everything is magical and everything is sunshine and rainbows. And that ideology or paradigm of just being in the happy place is not necessarily sustainable for everyone. From one perspective, it is. I can already hear somebody going, well, of course it's sustainable. We are love and light, but we are here on Earth at a time, if we want to label it as such, that includes things that are not always sunshine and rainbows. So it's a matter of us creating within ourselves this space for ourselves to experience all of these aspects from time to time. The more we hold in our experience, the more flavor, the more uniqueness, and the more expansion sometimes we actually experience. How many of us have had something happen in our lives that was extremely challenging, and we may not have felt sunshine and rainbows about it? That's like saying we have a family member that passes who we love very much unexpectedly, or a friend, and the law of attraction paradigm or group, and I'm not labeling any one person or group. This is just this ideology that, well, it happened for a reason, and you know, they're going to be happier on the other side, and you should just let it go. Well, from one perspective, that's all true. But from another perspective, that's what you think. That's what you feel. Or better spoken, I'm just saying that person that says, oh, you should just let it go, or you shouldn't feel down for too long, otherwise you lower your frequency. From another perspective, that's what you think is real, right? In your reality, based on what you've read, based on what that particular paradigm or group has experienced in their own reality, they've come to that conclusion that it should only be sunshine and rainbows. And maybe that works for them. But I'm seeing more and more often that's not working. And the reason it's not working is because it's not for everyone to stay that way all the time, because then it becomes a denial of the other emotions that are part of the human experience that are not necessarily sunshine and rainbows. Everyone is here to have their own journey. And we are not necessarily here to dictate to anyone else with our sunshine and rainbows that they should not be experiencing what they're experiencing, and that what they're experiencing is wrong. The message that I continually get shared with me from my team is there isn't a wrong way to have this experience that we call life. It's only what we think is wrong. Now, I will say that doesn't mean that we're getting the okay or the go ahead to go make everybody else feel bad, or be a person who goes out and just decides to push people over when we walk in the streets. This obviously has something to do with common sense, but better spoken beyond the common and into the higher sense, the higher sensibility. And the higher sensibility shows us that all of our experiences matter, because we're having these experiences in the body that is matter. We're in form that is matter. So everything we interact with has an impact on us. And sometimes we came here to interact with something in order to experience something that gave us the, what I'm seeing flavors, I'm seeing expansiveness, that gave us the vastness, that gave us the colors to experience. If we saw everything in rose-colored glasses and pink, that's great. That doesn't mean that's what we all came here to see, experience, and feel. Although at one time, maybe in another dimension, that is what that entire collective experiences and feels. And some people did come here just to anchor that. Generally speaking, though, those particular individuals are not the ones who are dictating to other people what they should or should not be doing, because then that turns into a lower frequency contribution. You're high up here, and then when we start to turn our gaze, our attention and focus on someone else, dictating to them that they're doing something wrong, that becomes a judgment. It becomes an energy, a focal point. Then we are no longer in neutrality from one perspective. We're no longer in that high vibe, everyone is love and light. Everyone is love and light. And I love you, so that's why I'm telling you what you're doing wrong. So I'm being called to really share this, because this is something that many of us are witnessing, and some of us have done it. You know, I've done it with certain people. When some of us are experiencing this continuity of perpetual bliss, we don't necessarily want to experience anything else because it feels so good. Yet, when we are not in that state of bliss and we're having something in our lives like a meltdown, we've lost a friend, we've had a life change in our health, or perhaps we've lost a job. In that moment, we shift. Sorry about the noise. We fall. We fall from here to what may be seen as a lower level by those who think they're here. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with those individuals who think that they're here all the time. But to be in denial and to deny those emotions that come with certain life experiences isn't the same as being in bliss. That is different. And so some of us are really being called to ask ourselves that. Am I denying an aspect of myself by continually trying to stay here? That isn't sustainable, because at some point there will be something that breaks that pattern. Not necessarily for everyone. Again, some people came here and that's all they came here to experience, and they can maintain that. However, sometimes when we have that break, we're being called to really feel the juice of the moment, which may be sadness. It may be a feeling of unworthiness. And then we recognize that it's just a feeling. It's an emotion. It's something that we are being called to witness, to feel, to perhaps recognize. And then in that, the witnessing, the feeling, and the recognition, we recognize that maybe it's a pattern within us that we had never necessarily dealt with before, or it was a pattern that continually came up when we were faced with a challenge. And now we're being gifted the opportunity to recognize it and say, oh, wow, that's fear. That's unworthiness. And I do feel that way. I do feel sad. And just in that, it shifts it completely and can bring us back to a place of bliss, or it can bring us into a state of acceptance, which is obviously that higher state of the long wave, coherence. So from my perspective, heart coherence isn't necessarily feeling this high of happy all the time. Heart coherence is a space of, it's the center of the circle or the toroidal field, where you can feel into things that are happening and not necessarily get pulled completely in those emotions or feelings. But that center is always there. So while we may get sucked into that tornado of emotion and we're being called to really experience it fully, we can still recognize that we're tethered to that central station of neutrality, of bliss. Bliss isn't necessarily high. It's just this space of, right? So just remembering, oh yes, I was there once, and I still am connected to that moment, because even though we may be experiencing sadness, shame, regret, doubt, whatever it might be, there was a time we were able to find bliss. So sometimes by giving ourselves that moment of, what if I didn't feel sad right now? What would that look like? What would that feel like? What if I could feel bliss right now? What would that look like? It might be eating an ice cream cone. Vegan one if you're vegan, whatever floats your boat. It might be going for a walk on the beach. That would make me the most happy right now. Going and seeing a friend. And by us taking the moment to stop and ask ourselves that question isn't denying what we're feeling. It's giving ourselves the opportunity to feel it and bring ourselves back to that center point, because actually we're already there. Because time isn't something that there is no past, present, future. It just is, right? So if we have experienced bliss before, the birth of a child, the happiness or joy of being with a loved one, connecting with the earth, it's different for everyone. We can bring ourselves back into that at any time. Play on words, right? So it's there now because it's happened before. Therefore, it's happening now. Therefore, even though we're experiencing sadness, we can simultaneously come back to a place of bliss because it's happening now, because it happened before. Does that make sense? I know that sounds funny, but that's a way to think about it. When I do a future projection for someone, and I don't always do this, but let's say I am doing a future reading, I see a potential in the field because that particular individual has projected their imagination into that potential so strongly because of their habitual patterns. That doesn't mean that it's going to happen from one perspective. However, the energy is so strong around that particular projection that I'm often able to feel into that version of a potential of reality as if it's happening now. And so therefore, it isn't necessarily in the future because we're perceiving it as now because we're in that frequency, which is the frequency that then creates that future. And I kind of am going into a multi-dimensional way of looking at things, but I think it's important to recognize that everything is connected. So as we allow ourselves to kind of recognize that we're sometimes just meant to be in different states of awareness, it allows us to recognize these different states. And this is part, again, of the layers of being a human. We have a huge range, is the word I was trying to think of. We're rangers. We have a huge range of emotion, of sound, of vocals, of thoughts, of creative abilities and talents. And we didn't all come here to have the same experience. We came here to share in this field of plenty, in this field of reality. And so that's going to look different for everyone. So I was just really being called to encourage people not to get discouraged. And when I say that, even that's something that I wouldn't necessarily say, don't get discouraged. You're going to potentially be discouraged at moments. And if you're watching this and you say, well, I'm not discouraged, the question becomes, have I ever been discouraged before or felt discouraged? Most likely the answer is yes. Therefore, that's a range in the emotions that we've experienced. And we could continually go back to that if we wanted to. But the question that I'm leading into is what if? So I'm really being called to play with this. And I've mentioned this in other videos. Rather than projecting ourselves into, what if this person is mad at me? What if the world comes to an end tomorrow? What if this doesn't work out? You know, so on and so forth. What if I don't get the job? What if I get fired? What if I get sick? What if I catch this? Fill in the blanks. My guidance team has called me to shift that. And one of the examples I used was in the video I did about not sleeping a few weeks back, or maybe a week back. Again, sorry about the noise outside. And the question that came through was, I was not sleeping, which by the way is a huge topic right now. It's still relevant. And I would wake up at 3 a.m., just like many people are. And I would lay there going, what if I don't get back to sleep? I'm going to feel awful tomorrow. I've got this going on and that going on. And I would get annoyed and I would try all these things to go back to sleep. But then I asked myself, what if I just woke up? What if I'm awake? What if I just get up and write down what I'm thinking about? And that projects me into that future. Meaning, if I think, what if I just get up and write down my thoughts on a piece of paper? I think about getting up and writing my thoughts down on a piece of paper, which would be happening after I think about it. Therefore, I'm projecting that into my future 5 minutes from now. And then I feel into that future. Does that make sense? That's how it works. So there's these simple little things that my guides are like, okay, so as soon as I start thinking about that, I feel differently because now I'm giving myself another option that I didn't necessarily give myself before. I asked the question, what if I just got up? Rather than these future projections of what if the worst happens? What if I can't? What if this? So it's what if it was for a good thing? So I get up, I write down what I'm thinking about, and lo and behold, 10 minutes later, I'm ready to go back to sleep. What if I wouldn't have done that? I would have been up for another hour, tossing and turning. What if I got up and did yoga? What if I got up and journaled? What if I got up and just fill in the blanks? I ask myself those individual questions because then as soon as I do that, the second thing that's happening is I'm feeling into what it is that my body wants or what it is that my higher self is trying to get me to recognize or realize. So for example, if I say, what if I get up and stretch? I feel in my body the response to that projection of, yes, that's what my body wants actually. So I get up, I give it a shot and I feel better. Or I might feel like, no, my body doesn't want to move right now, but my head is going crazy. So what if I wrote? And that's when I get the yes in my body. So I get up, I get my blankie, maybe have a cup of tea, at 3 a.m. and I write and I allow whatever comes through to come through. And that's sometimes the best, that's the best in those moments. I changed the frequency around being in a state of, I can't sleep, what if, this or that. And I became open-ended with an open-ended question. How would I feel? What if? What would that look like? I projected that potential in my reality, and then I fell into that potential that I was asking myself about. So that's been one of the tools that I use a lot that I'm just sharing with you guys. And I've used this so often in sessions. Sometimes I'm called to ask certain what if questions when I'm working with someone that particular person wouldn't have thought of asking themselves. Some of them are very obvious and some are not. Sometimes I'm called to ask a question. Someone will ask me a question in session, but I'm hearing that that's not the real question. I'm hearing there's a question behind the question. What is that? So that's a whole other can of worms. But essentially, we're really being called to go back. And so I'm going to go back to what I was saying in the beginning of this video, to use our sensibility, our ability to sense into the bigger picture, and to get out of this conditioning. I was having a beautiful conversation with someone the other day about conditioning. With a friend of mine. And so get out of the conditioning of assuming the worst or not being able to get out of our head, or and tune into our own innate sense ability, our ability to sense more than, right, common sense. It's above common. And it's so funny because when I say common sense, I see a comma, like it's more than that. Okay. So that might be where we end today with this particular recording. I think I'll go into a little bit of flow. Oh, I am being called to go back and talk about the stabilization of the energies and talk about the love and light, sunshine, and rainbows. This can be very helpful for us and very valuable for us. That whole feeling of feeling into the positive. And so this can I'm going to bring it back in full circle, that law of attraction, like what would it feel like if I felt good? But I just want to reiterate that sometimes we're not there. Sometimes if you've ever looked at that scale on the law of attraction, I recommend it. It's pretty cool and pretty useful. If we're in a place of depression or despair, and I'm not sure what all the words are, it's not like we can even feel what that moment where we experienced bliss before. We can't remember it. It's in there somewhere, but we're so low on the ladder that sometimes we just have to ask ourselves question like, well, what if I could feel bliss right now? What if, and there's that disconnect that we can't quite get there. So rather than giving up on it, perhaps we give up on that particular agenda or goal and we try something different. Well, I don't necessarily feel like I can get to that state of sunshine and rainbows. What if I went for a walk? What if I sat down and just did some meditations and breath work? And the answer may not be an answer. It may be, I don't know. It may be nothing. But at least we're starting to open ourselves up to that potential. And then almost guaranteed, if we do something like that, we take the appropriate action that is no longer in the linearization timeline of despair or whatever it might be. We shift it just a little bit to bring us into a little bit higher of a resonance, a higher frequency. And it's those little tiny things that we do throughout the day in many cases that are going to be what brings us to the higher resonance and frequency and the sunshine and rainbows state on a more sustainable basis than if we try to jump timelines completely and get back to that state of bliss. Oh, I have to get back there. Because that puts us in pressure And then again, I go back to what I was saying in the beginning, we're denying our human experience of not being in bliss right now. We can then be missing valuable opportunities to be able to close out certain chapters, to clear out certain relationships or timelines, to dissolve certain or integrate certain habitual emotions that we haven't been allowing ourselves to experience. Or maybe that we haven't experienced since we were a child. Maybe we're experiencing this because we're having these cellular memories coming up in our body, and we're remembering a time when we felt really insecure or when we felt unsafe. Something triggered it, brought us out of our sunshine and rainbows. Then we've got somebody making us feel guilty because we're not in a sunshine and rainbows place, and then it's a snowball effect from there. So we're just being really called to kind of tune into things, maybe just a little differently than we have been in the past. And again, I'm also being called to touch on that briefly, because I mentioned earlier, well, we want to get back to that place of bliss because we've been there before. We had a child that was born, and in that moment, we were in a complete place of love and bliss. Well, we may not be able to necessarily conjure up that exact moment or that exact feeling. And that's something else I'm being called to remind everybody that it's okay, because this moment's bliss in this version of who we are now with a child that's maybe 10 years old, it may be something different and slightly different energy around bliss that inspires us. It's not always about trying to get back to that high, because that high is different because we're a different person than we were, let's say 10 years ago, right? Or 5 months ago or whatever. So it's always recognizing, again, that's an example of, yes, we've had it before, therefore it's available now. But it might look different now in this now moment than it did when it initially occurred. And that's, I know, sounds kind of confusing, but I think it's valuable to recognize that it's not always going to feel the same. Sometimes we get hung up on these past versions of ourselves. I used to be this, I used to do this, and I'm guilty of that at times as well. You know, it used to look like this. I don't want it to change. And this is where I'm going to end. The guidance team in my previous 3 or 4 videos in which I was doing what some people call channeling, or I'm just dropping in and allowing my, I call it somatic word expression to come through. The guidance team, my higher self, is basically saying, allow. I say and write over and over again, allow, let it be, allow, because many of us are not allowing ourselves to experience the change because there's a lot of reasons. Fear of change. We don't want to lose that high. We don't feel like we deserve to feel good. On and on and on. We don't necessarily feel capable, right? So because we haven't done it in the past, some people out there have never experienced bliss. So how could I experience it if I've never experienced it? Well, I'm going to pause for just a moment. I got a lot of noise out there. I lost track of where I was going with that. I had to pause my video. I think I'm just going to end on that. I was probably on like some track and maybe it'll come to me later. Apologies on that. I'll just end on this note. We are all doing our best. We are all doing our best on this journey, and it doesn't always feel like we're doing our best. But my guidance team is constantly pointing out we are having such a ripple effect on reality in such a positive way. Many people are painting this picture that it isn't, and doom and gloom and perpetual cycles of disharmony. And while that has been the case, it doesn't have to be this time around. And it doesn't require us to only be one way. We are already one. So it does require us, though, if we do want to create a reality that is sustainable and centered around bliss and love, it does require us to be responsible for our emotions and to feel what it is that we're experiencing, so that we don't continue to project what it is that we don't want to experience down the road. And we can do that by being in a place of fake, inauthentic normalcy, if we want to call it that. And so that's what the guidance team is like, look, you're having a huge impact. You don't have to pretend that everything's okay if it's not. But by us acknowledging and shifting that, we get into a true place of harmony and bliss. And so not being so hard on ourselves all of the time is part of this. And that includes being hard on ourselves about not being in a place of bliss. Have to stay positive, must keep going. Everything's great. Everything is awesome. So, on another note, I'll add too, there's a lot of shifts that are happening this year, already have happened. There is an advanced culture that is essentially emerging as us, as an advanced human creators. We are the human creators. So that's a positive thing if we can allow ourselves, oh, that was what I was saying earlier, allow, let go, allow ourselves. We're not necessarily, it's like we get so focused or we get so conditioned to be in a habit pattern that these new things drop into our field and we're like, we can't look at that, or we can't feel this way, or we're not allowing ourselves to feel into what if we're already in a new reality and we just didn't know it. All those kinds of fun questions. So in love and light, guys, thank you so much for tuning in and sharing in this now moment. And until the next time, namaste.